Welcome back. Now we answer questions we've received from you, our viewers. If you have a question, visit our website, QuranSpeaks.com. Dr. Shabir, the question is, if the Quran is sufficient for all of our means and way of life, why do we need hadith?
So when we say that the Quran is sufficient, we mean that it outlines the basics. It gives us you can say the skeleton of what Islam is going to be, but you still need flesh and sinews to complete the whole body. You can say that the Quran is the foundation, but you're going to build on that foundation. You need doors and windows and all of that. So the Quran tells us basically the commands of God. It gives us the basic outline of the features, the moral system of this religion, and then the detailed applications come in the Hadith. So what are Hadith then? Hadiths are reports about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, telling us about what he said, what he did, what happened in his presence, and he seemed to approve of it. So all of this become now precedent for Islamic law. Now, hadiths are important also for a historical reconstruction of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because that forms the basis and you can say the context of the Quran itself. The Quran was, we believe, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, a piece at a time over a period of 23 years. Different things were happening at the time, and the Quran was given as revelation and instruction dealing with the specific circumstances as they unfolded. So there could be a marriage, there could be a war, and the Quran is speaking to all of these different and changing circumstances. So to know those circumstances within the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we need the hadith for a kind of historical reconstruction. Now, this all of what we've said here does not mean that everything that is mentioned in the hadith is necessarily authentic. The Muslim scholars struggle to differentiate between the authentic and inauthentic, because after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, people started to claim various things about what the Prophet, peace be upon him, said and did, because they wanted to justify their particular positions, either a position of belief or a particular practice, or even to support a political entity. So the Muslim scholars had to weigh and sift and go back to the history of these various snippets of information to find out, like, who told you that? Because you haven't met the Prophet, you say the Prophet said this. Who told you that the Prophet said this? And you say your teacher. Well, who told your teacher? And so we have to trace the link all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to see that there has been a continuous relay chain of persons who are all reliable, so that we can depend on that piece of information. But relay chains like this, human chains, are necessarily subject to error and mismemory and all of this. So we have to just continue to weigh and sift all of that information. The Muslim scholars did a great job in the past, and we need to continue using all of the tools that God has blessed us to be aware of in continuing that work of sifting between wheat and chaff, holding on to that which was clearly from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and rejecting that which, or at least laying aside that which we cannot be confident of.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Shabir, there are some Muslims who actually reject all hadith, right? In that circumstance, what would they rely on to be able to pray and to perform, zakah and other things that are obligatory in Islam?
Yeah, so
would they rely, for example, on the community, like the community practice that was passed on over time? We know that, for example, prayer hasn't died out, right? It has continued over time in all different sorts of places and times.
Yeah, I haven't studied the other approaches in detail, Safia, to be able to answer on behalf of the proponents of those systems to say, how do they do it? But I know that looking at it from my perspective, and when I weighed the various options, what should be the correct approach here, I know, first of all, that it would be historically irresponsible to just wipe away all of the hadith, pretend we have none of that, and just go with the Quran alone. It would mean the Quran is standing in a vacuum. So I know that we need both the Quran and the hadith from a historical point of view. Some historians took a radical approach of saying, let's throw away all of the hadiths altogether, and let's rely on non-Muslim sources. This was most championed by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook. But later on, there's been a lot of rethinking about that approach. Even Patricia Crone herself, before her death, wrote an article which is on the Islam and Democracy website, something of this nature. But you can easily find it, Patricia Crone, and her article about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So in the end, she acknowledges that there is so much that we can, in fact, know about the Prophet, peace be upon him, even from Muslim sources. So in the end, historically, we need to go back to the hadith to reconstruct the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And that serves as the context within which the Quran has been revealed. So we need the hadith for that reason. But you're asking about the details of Islamic practice. And Muslims, yes, do rely on the hadith for details of Islamic practice. But to be sure, you touched upon a point that one might, if one didn't have the hadiths themselves, one might in fact still be privy to Islamic practices by knowing what they have been from generations, all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So let's take the prayer as an example. Now, it is often argued that we need the hadith because we need the details of the prayer, and the details are found in the hadith. But those details are found in hadith only as a kind of a last resort. In case there was an argument, we could go back to the hadith and find that there is a mention of this or that detail of our prayer in a hadith. But hardly does anyone go to the books of hadith to construct the whole system of prayer. If you go to the hadith books to try and do this, you might find yourself all confused because so many different narratives, one saying do it this way, one saying do it the other way, and so on. It takes a lot of scholars to work on these books of hadith to be able to distill from the various narratives the specific sequence of items that we include within our prayer. But what is easier for Muslims, and has proved easier for Muslims throughout the generations, is that we have learned from the previous generation how to pray. And so, children coming to the mosque, they see how the prayer is done. They gather bits and pieces from here and there. They may have a little handbook of prayer, which itself is compiled based on the established practice among Muslims. And so that's how most Muslims learn how to pray. We learn from our parents, who learn from their parents, who learn from their parents, all the way back to the earliest generations of Muslims. So too with fasting and giving charity and so on. Now, the Quran tells us to give charity. It uses the term sadaqah and it uses the term zakah almost interchangeably to represent charity. But it doesn't tell you how much charity is to be given. So how do we arrive at 2.5% of one's net liquefiable assets at the end of 1 year? Well, all of these details come from hadith. And so if we said, okay, we won't follow the hadith, then how might we know how much charity to give? Well, it's already common knowledge. So it's not that a Muslim goes and finds it in the hadith and then comes and says, now I know this is what it is. But if there happens to be a dispute, then one might be able to go back to the books of hadith and say, oh, well, this detail is in fact mentioned there. So the hadiths then, we can say, do serve as a repository of information about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and about the early practices of Islam, such that while we are following the Quran as lived by the earliest Muslim communities and by one generation after another, we can always go back to the hadith to have that serve as a confidence booster that the religion, has not been invented out of whole cloth. It is based on precedent. It is based on what was observed by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the earliest generations of Muslims.
Thank you for that, Dr. Shabir. That's very interesting.
You're welcome.
Tired of seeing how Muslims are depicted in media? You can help. Support Muslim Media Hub, the first of its kind to empower young Muslims to create content for film, TV, and social media. Visit our website, QuranSpeaks.com, and donate.